Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I am so glad to be here today talking about normal booktube things for the first time in a long time. For those of you who've watched this channel for a very long time, you might remember that I used to have something kind of like Friday Reads, but a lot more random. Not usually on Fridays and not on a regular schedule at all. I talked about what I'd been reading, what some of my favorite booktube conversations had been, and also a bit about what grabbed me in the New York Times book review, or occasionally in other book reviews or journals. And then a few months ago, I did a couple of joint discussions with Steve Donahue over on his channel, where the two of us sat down to chat together over Zoom and talk about what we thought about the most recent issue. He and I often have pretty different opinions from each other, and we certainly have different styles as well, and it was enormous fun to get to play off against him. It was also pretty great to have this new lens on the review. I started reading it a bit more carefully, and certainly more completely, rather than just reading the reviews that especially interested me when I was preparing for those conversations with Steve. And I really got a lot more out of the experience than I had when I just read particular pieces. I'd not realized how many reviews seemed to be speaking to one another. While I really hope Steve and I can find a way to revive that series of Zoom chats, I thought today I would point out some of the interesting books and interesting reviews from this week's past issue. One of my favorite sections most weeks is By the Book, when the New York Times Book Review asks famous authors to answer a series of questions, which differ a bit from interview to interview, but include questions like, what's on your nightstand, or what authors would you invite to a dinner party? This week, the interviewee spot was given to James Hannaham, whose work I've never read, and whose interview was not especially noteworthy in my book, with a couple of exceptions. He gives two extremely brief but well-targeted answers I wanted to share with you. When asked, quote, which subjects do you wish more authors would write about, Hannaham says, things that are not themselves. While I already had Steve Donahue on my mind when I picked up the book review, I suspect this particular answer made him nod his head. The second question he answered tersely but wisely was, what books are you embarrassed not to have read yet? And here the answer comes straight from my heart, most of them. I suppose I would probably not use the word embarrassed. I might use disappointed in myself or something instead. But sometimes I just think, as long as I've been reading, how could I not yet have read this classic or that one or whatever? And instead of starting to catch up as I continue to age and read, I seem to get farther and farther behind with new must-read classics going on my TBR that I hadn't even heard of before BookTube. I mentioned that one of the things I liked about reading in preparation for a video with Steve was that I read sections I might have skipped otherwise. I don't think I ever had read the thrillers column, for example. This week, the reviewer looked at 3 books, including Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian and McAllister, and the review included this amazing line. The book is, quote, a high-concept mashup of different genres that transcends the wackadoodle premise with an affecting portrayal of a family careening toward crisis. I wonder how many times wackadoodle has made it into the pages of the New York Times. One of the other regular columns I almost never read is the crime and mystery section. As usual, more or less, the column mentions 3 books, and the last one mentioned is Valerie Burns' 2-part sugar, 1-part murder, which sounds, well, sweet. It's the story of a bakery owner who solves murders with her friends, along with a large dog named Baby. They call themselves the Baker Street Irregulars, of course. Since Dictember is right around the corner, a time to read books about private detectives, I thought I would put it on your radar, especially if you're less interested in hard-boiled detectives and more interested in nicely baked treats. Of the books receiving full reviews, I think the one that appealed to me the most was Diary of a Misfit, a memoir and a mystery by Casey Parks. After reading that initial thriller review about genre mashups, I thought about how this book is a mashup of its own, of both a memoir and a biography. The book begins with Park, coming of age in the U.S. South, where I was also raised, as she decides to come out as a lesbian to her family. For those of you who are unaware of regional differences in the States, the culture of the South, or at least the culture of the rural white South, is typically much more conservative than the Northeast or California or something like that. When Parks comes out to her mother starts crying. But then her mother, Parks' grandmother, tells her to get over it, using this perfect phrase: "Some people eat hot dogs and some people eat fish." When she tries to discover where her grandmother's apparent progressivism comes from, she learns that Granny had lived across the street from Roy, a person she identifies as a woman who lives as a man, but that Parks refers to with masculine pronouns. This book sounds like a fascinating exploration of Roy's life, as an outcast, as Parks says, in the South all those decades ago, and at the same time, an exploration of how Parks herself, also kind of an outcast, sees Roy and others like him as kindred spirits. Near the end of the review, by Michelle Hart, I think, is this sentence: "Most moving is Parks' depiction of a queer lineage, an ancestry of outcast, a tapestry of fellow misfits into which the marginalized will always, for better or worse, fit. Ourselves are so often an assemblage of those who came before." I can imagine that Carson McCullers would really love to read this book, were she still alive, and that her novels, perhaps especially The Ballad of the Sad Cafe, would be a perfect book to store in the Outcast archives. A couple of pages later in the New York Times Book Review, there's a discussion by Leah Greenblatt of the novel The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. The review didn't really make me want to read the book, but I was intrigued to see that it too focused on self-defined outcasts, this time aged-out foster kids who don't quite fit anywhere. The main character is an autodidact who works in an avant-garde pie shop where pie flavors include lavender lamb and banana charcoal. The reviewer appreciates some of the book, but gives this little bomb near the end. As with many new novelists, and a lot of veteran ones too, her longer monologues tend to come off less like the cadences of ordinary speech than the workshopped thoughts of a star student placed between quotation marks, says Greenblatt. She continues, quote, "Gunty earned an MFA in creative writing at NYU. In other words, not much of an outsider, at least in regards to the literary world. Neither this book nor the pies seem particularly inviting." Well, I think I'll wrap up with a discussion of one more outcast book, The Prophet of the Andes, An Unlikely Journey to the Promised Land by Graciela Mochkofsky, whose name I'm sure I am mispronouncing. The review, written by novelist Kat Rosenfield, is wide-ranging. Let me read the beginning. "The words Peru and spiritual journey have taken on certain connotations in the era of hallucinogenic tourism. But decades before the Amazon became a destination for disaffected millennials to confront their demons on all-inclusive plant medicine retreats, it was a place to test one's faith in the sight of one man's all-consuming search for understanding, for truth, and eventually for salvation in a whole new land halfway around the world." Fairly early in his life, Segundo Villanueva found a Bible hidden in a trunk that had belonged to his late father. And when he started reading it, he was struck by what he saw as absolutely representative in the Jewish Bible, basically the books that Christians call the Old Testament, of the land around him in Peru and the circumstances of the people he lived with. Increasingly over the years, he became more and more committed and more knowledgeable about the teachings and practices of Judaism. When he approached rabbis in a desire to convert, he was discouraged over and over again. But he continued his quest and soon had hundreds of followers who also tried to convert to Judaism and even to migrate to Israel. I spend a lot of my time thinking about what Jewish identity means and who can claim that identity. Identifying as a Christian seems to have a clear definition having to do with belief, although clearly what precisely one believes and practices can be quite different from other Christians. But Judaism is both broader and narrower. A few people might claim that belief is at its heart, but a much higher percentage would say that practice or observance is at the core. There are plenty of folks who neither have faith nor choose to follow religious observances, but still consider themselves Jewish. What does it mean there? Is it culture, tradition, or is it about bloodlines, ethnicity, rather than religion per se? Although Jews don't proselytize to non-Jews, assuming we're not talking about Messianic Jews here, which is a very different thing, Jewish communities do accept converts, and in fact it's an important part of Jewish practice to accept people who've converted just as much as people who were born Jewish into the community. I say that conversion is part of Judaism, but of course there's been a long history of racism and even xenophobia within the Jewish community, just as there has been more globally. And the idea of someone from another land coming with a whole community of his own, as Villanueva was, well, let's just say that his community remained outsiders, outcasts, to use the language we've seen in other reviews in this issue of the New York Times. In the 1960s, they settled in a war-torn West Bank and never really were allowed to join the larger Jewish community. Still, I think it's that word outcast that's the reason why this story is so compelling. As the author writes, Villanueva and his followers created, quote, a Judaism with no past and no tradition, with no memory of persecution, the Holocaust, or the struggles for Zionism. And yet, the narrative of displacement is no less compelling for it. The Peruvian converts were fleeing not persecution, but abject poverty fueled by government corruption. Their synagogue had dirt floors, no indoor plumbing, a windowless, roofless place of worship, lit only by candles. And as the author writes, quote, Israel was no less a beacon to these newly minted Jews. Despite the fact that Villanueva, quote-ish, sows continually without reaping and seeks endlessly without finding, the book reviewer, Kat Rosenfield, claims him by another familiar name, the Wandering Jew. Well, I think that'll do it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.